Welcome again to the 1619 Project podcast. My name is Antonio Ruiz with my partner in crime,
Thomas Fields. Hello, Antonio.
And crime is a good way of introducing Chapter 10, Punishment. Off mic, we were talking about an article in the Long Beach Post about a young man, he's way younger than us, but he's in his 30s, who's going to be freed soon because one of the police officers involved in his arrest and in his trial was charged with lying on another case, calling into question his testimony against this young man who was arrested some years ago. I think he's now served 10 or 11 years of a 39-year sentence where it was an incident where he's actually was charged with assault on a police officer, but he didn't actually assault any police officer. He was running away from these two police officers, and they, in fact, shot him 4 times. The gun that he had in his hand when he was first confronted was found not in his waistband or in his hand, but was found nearby. But what I'm just still kind of reeling from is this idea that he was sentenced to 39 years in jail, which is a good way of introducing this whole subject of punishment in chapter 10 here of the 1619 Project. Let's start there. Punishment, Thomas, and this is not unusual, a 39-year sentence for a questionable arrest, questionable trial, questionable testimony from a police officer. You said, I don't know why we're shocked and surprised.
I mean, why is there? I mean, understandably there is shock, because anytime a person goes to prison, innocent or has a sentence that is unduly, unfairly pronounced, that's sad. But this is routine. That's sad to say. It's routine in this country. Just today, Alabama executed a man, and they executed a guy for killing his ex-girlfriend. Homicide is horrible. Let me state that up front. But this guy killed a single human being. Of course, it happens that he's Black in the state of Alabama, which has got its own hands bloodied from numerous state terrorist crimes. But they sentenced this guy to to death. The problem is that punishment is given out unfairly. And I could bet you any amount of money that you could find that same criminal justice system, numbers of people who had killed multiple people and received life sentences. So, the question becomes, why is this one different? And I mean, race obviously played into it. And what's even more striking is that the victim's children requested that he be spared the death penalty. They said, we forgave him. Of course, the state doesn't forgive him, because how dare he, and that's the problem I think that we have in this criminal judicial system. It's not justice. It's often vengeance. It's often racial discrimination. It's bigotry, but it's often anything but fair and equal justice.
I was just blown away when I was looking at some of the statistics that begin. This chapter is written by someone who founded a project called the Equal Justice Initiative. And some of the statistics, we've all heard these statistics before. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration of any nation on earth. This country contains 4% of the planet's population, but 20% of its prisoners. In the early 1970s, our prisons and jail held fewer than 350,000 people. Since then, that number has increased to about 2.3 million, with 4.5 million more on probation or parole. More than 200,000 Americans are currently condemned to life sentences or virtual life sentences of 50 years or longer. Then there's, he quotes a study from the 1980s, found that in Georgia, Black defendants convicted of killing white people were almost 22 times more likely to be sentenced to death than people convicted of crimes against Black victims. And a racial disparity that the United States Supreme Court accepted as inevitable in a controversial 1987 case. And yet, I mean, these, you can get really granular with all these statistics, and yet there's almost we were talking about this in the last episode, talking about self-defense. There's this whole thing that because people are frightened of crime, their knee-jerk reaction always is, we need to keep these criminals. Well, first of all, we need to arrest as many people as possible, because the more people we arrest, we're going to feel somehow safer. Well, first of all, let's put more police, let's arrest more people, let's put more people in jail, and more importantly, let's keep them there. Doesn't matter if they're innocent or guilty, as long as they're in jail away from us. And that just continues this theme of like, yes, but that burden seems to always fall principally on Black and brown people.
Of course. You mentioned crime, and I was astonished to find out from a study that's done every year by The Economist magazine, and they're not flaming liberal publication.
Yeah.
And they put out a book, and one of the things they talk about in this book, where they point out, is the number of people that are incarcerated, the amount of crime throughout the world. They break down statistics, and next to the statistics which they have for the number of people incarcerated in the United States, percentage-wise, as you point out, 4%, yet 20% of the world's population. Now, they don't break it down racially. They just break down those.
No, it's 4% of the population, 20%.
World,
right.
20% of the world's prison population.
Right.
It happens to be in American jails.
Right.
And next to that graph that they show is another graph. And they show of the top 10 nations with the highest crime in the world. Okay. And they do it for homicides, they do it for burglaries, and they do it, I think, for sexual assaults. Do you know that the United States is not on any of those three charts? Yet, we again lead the world in incarceration of people. So either we over-incarcerate and we use crime as a fear tactic, or these charts are wrong.
We would never use fear as a tactic.
Yeah. The other thing I'll just say is this: with all of the issues we have with incarceration, with policing, my question is this: why has there not been a United Nations human rights violation towards this country? I mean, if we were another country in this world, in fact, if this were a country which was at odds with the United States, the first thing we point up is our criminal justice system. How arbitrary it is, how inhumane it is, and how unfair it is. Those are human rights violations which any other country would be taken to the UN.
I wrote a paper for school once. because I have a nephew who has gone through the prison system, and no one justifies what he did when he was 21 years old, a robbery, a couple of robberies, because he was addicted to drugs, and he committed these with a gun enhancement. And I think his original sentence was something like 13 or 15 years, something like that. He served, I think, 12. And what got me was I kept thinking, well, wait a second. This was a first offense, not justifying what happened, but why wasn't he sent to some kind of a diversion program? Mm-hmm. Why wasn't, he was 21 years old. And he, now he's doing fine and all that. But it was interesting, when I was doing the research, it was like, again, it starts with the police encounter. You're thrown into the legal system. Some 95% of cases that go into the trial system, into the legal system, end up in some kind of a plea bargain.
Mm-hmm.
And, they promised, they were going to throw the book at him. He had, some kind of legal aid that, I'm sure had 500 cases that day.
Mm-hmm.
And he settles for, going to jail instead of, again, having a lawyer that would have said, look, let's try to see if there's some kind of a diversion. Mm-hmm. And I just and I say all this because it was interesting reading this chapter where the writer talks about the number of 13 and 14-year-olds, children, mm-hmm. in this country are sentenced to life in prison without parole or non-homicide offenses.
Yeah.
And I think about my nephew, but I think about, once you're in that grinder, unless you have a really good lawyer, you're just negotiating for the best deal, whether you did it or not.
Yeah, you left out probably the most significant statistic of what you read, which is that all of the 13 and 14-year-olds who were sentenced to life in prison without parole for non-homicide offenses were Black, Latino, or Native Americans.
Yeah, yes.
That's all. Yes. Now, not one was of Caucasian persuasion, but all of them.
Yeah.
And this goes back to this whole thing that when many people in authority see a youth of color, they see a potential crime perpetrator. They don't see a kid. Black children, brown children, Native mm-hmm. children don't have the opportunity to have a childhood because they are looked at upon as being adults. They're potential felons. And that statistic points it out probably more blatantly than any other.
But again, it goes back to what we said in the last episode. They see these videos of packs of young, in many cases, Black and brown kids stealing, and that's played on a loop. And because it'll make them feel better, their idea is what we need to do is, because they brand all kids this way, but even if they did do these thefts, that they're not given an equal opportunity of legal representation. In most cases, they're going to end up with legal aid, and every legal aid person will tell you, listen, I've got 500 cases. I'm trying to just get them the best deal they can get. But then it's at the discretion of, there's a probation report. There is prosecutors who are trying to set an example. There's whether or not they had priors that they may have committed when they were 13 years old. I mean, I've seen this up close as both a juror and as a defendant once, and you start to see that this is all about processing people through a meat grinder. And I just think that that's this illusion that's been created that, you know, our legal system is fair and because it keeps us safe from those people. And we know who they're talking about.
Yes, it's true that there is this illusion, but let's look at the absolute reality behind this. You have a judicial system. It's a criminal judicial system. The vast majority of people on the side of prosecuting people are white. The vast majority. They make significantly more money than the people who come before them. The people who come before them are poor. Okay. That it starts with those kids put in those schools in the ghetto schools. You call it what it is. They lack the funding, they lack the teachers, and no one really gives a damn. Okay, and their options when they come out are typically that they're going to end up, either non-employed, underemployed, or in prison. And the system is set up that way intentionally. And we can go back through why the system is set up intentionally that way, because basically it wants low wages. And that goes back to slavery, that goes back to Reconstruction, that goes back to, pre-civil rights days, whatever. It's economics. Again, you got cops who are, in those communities are seen as basically occupying forces. That's what they are. They're there. They're not there to basically solve murders, solve homicides, because you look again at the homicide rates, the lowest homicide rates in any city across this country will be in black and brown neighborhoods. Simple. So what's happening is they're there to keep the lid on something. They're also there to keep that pipeline going. The pipeline that goes directly from the schools up to the prison system. And again, where are the prison systems located? They're located in, almost without exception, in rural white communities in the areas of those states. Because what that does, it provides economic benefits for those places. It does provide economic benefits for the people that are living in those communities where they're being taken from. Not only that, and probably worse than that, when you have a system for drug prosecutions like we have, where 80% of the drug felonies are coming from those communities, what you're doing is you're destroying the community. And often those crimes, drug crimes, are nonviolent. Yes, they're violent drug crimes, but the vast majority are nonviolent. So what you're doing is you're taking out men, young men, you're taking out boys, and you put them in that system. You are destroying communities. Forget about the freeways going through it. Forget about the discrimination in employment. Just that factor, social factor alone, destroys this community. It's done for a reason. It's done for economic reasons.
And what's worse is that you start to get, there's no thought, the consequences of when, because this idea that, oh, we're going to arrest them, we're going to put them through the system, we're going to put them in jail, and we're going to go safe. Well, inevitably, most of them are going to leave one day, okay? Whether it's in 5 years or 3 years or a year, or maybe even 20 years. And what happens to them when they leave? Where do they get? That was part of the whole paper, is that where's the relief when they come out of these systems? Where are the support systems for helping them come back into society so that they don't go back to prison? I just want to.
Do you want to be cynical about it, man?
Well,
okay. We don't care. Because you know where they go.
Obvious we don't care.
They go back to those communities, and if they commit crimes, they'll be on those people. They'll prey on those people in those communities. We, the whiter, broader community, don't give a damn because it ain't impacting us.
Well, if they've been in jail for 10 to 15 years, trust me, those communities probably don't even exist when they go back to the way they did. Of course they don't. But
they will always find the poorest area. And what are you going to do when you can't get a job? What are you going to do when you can't find housing? Because Guess what? When you're a felon, you don't have those opportunities. And that, you don't think that's intentional? You can't not unintentionally make a system as bad as we have developed in this country
Right.
in the criminal justice system. It's impossible for it to be unintentional.
He talks about some really interesting questions on page 278. When we talk, all these statistics that we rattled off earlier, and he said, he asked these rules, how did it come to this? How did we arrive at a point of so much over incarceration, abusive policing, and excessive punishment? Why are racial disparities so pronounced throughout the system? And we cannot answer these questions without understanding the legacy of slavery and the harsh and racialized instinct for punishment our history has created. And once you begin to look at this background, and this is not just, yes, he does go back to 1664, 1720. He talks about, the 1800s, giving an example, 1861 ruling, as the Supreme Court of Alabama explained, enslaved Black people were capable of committing crimes, and in that capacity were regarded as persons, but in most every other sense, they were incapable of performing civil acts and considered things, not persons. And then he talks about the 13th Amendment, but this is not just ancient history. This is like real stuff that's happening today. And he points out, for instance, Richard Nixon's war on drugs, because you mentioned the war on drugs earlier, his idea that a new politics of fear and anger emerged and gave rise to the era of mass incarceration, both Richard Nixon's war on drugs and then the 1990, what was it?
So you have to, Bill Clinton's the welfare.
Was it 94 or 96? I'm trying to remember now. But that all of these things were not isolated incidents or events, but actually were policies going back to the beginning of enslavement in this country.
Do you recall the disparity in sentencing for rock cocaine and regular flake cocaine?
Okay. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, it's real curious because rock cocaine, which was cheap,
right?
You could buy basically for $5, you could buy a little speck and you get high on that. Cocaine, which particularly during the powder cocaine, particularly during the 80s, 70s and 80s, was predominantly used by whites because it was expensive. It was used by whites in the suburbs, used by whites often in entertainment, in fashion industry, right? The few of them, and I say them, there were fewer busts of people using cocaine than there were crack. Crack, they did sweeps. They rounded up people by droves. They didn't do that in suburbs. They didn't do that, for example, in Madison Avenue. They didn't do that in the fashion industry. And if you were unlucky enough to be busted with cocaine, you got, maybe you got a couple years, I say 5 years, right? Let's say. But if you were the usual suspect and got popped with crack, you were looking at, in most cases, life in prison. The disparity was unbelievable, and that's the fact. And you start with stuff like that. It was again intentional. They knew who was, and when I say they, I'm talking about lawmakers and I'm talking about the criminal justice system. They knew very well who were using those drugs. They knew very well how that would be, how it would come down, and how it would slam those communities.
And who was, by the way, and we should mention that who was also buying those drugs. It wasn't just Black and brown people in those communities. It was kids from the suburbs or from white kids. Yeah. I mean, people were coming, not just kids. I mean, there were adults who were coming into those communities to pick up. Baltimore, if anybody who's ever watched The Wire, on HBO, about the crack gangs, crack cocaine in Baltimore, know that. It's this whole thing again about getting back to the very idea of punishment versus, okay, you punish and then what? This idea of rehabilitation, and I go back to people who suffer from drug addiction. I mean, we're a little bit more enlightened today, but not that much more. There are still courts in this country who will sentence you to some exorbitant amount of time because you're a drug addict and you've been caught, like using a gun or a knife, or in some cases, just robbing somebody. And you get thrown into that system, that grinder again. And when you serve your sentence, you've been punished, but no thought's been given to what happens after the punishment. No thought's been given to, have I given this up? Instead of, if I'm a drug addict, you think that putting me in prison will help me with my drug addiction? No, because in most cases, I'm just going to continue the addiction in prison. And then when I come out, am I better or worse than when I went in? And I think that's the thing that I don't think we talk enough about. This idea that what happens to those folks when we leave prison. I mean, yes, we should be talking about how how abusive the system is to throw people into prisons with almost like no thought. I mean, thought, yes, but no discussion of what the implications are. But then I'm particularly interested in what happens when you leave, because inevitably you're going to leave.
Well, 2 points. One, compare our judicial system versus Western European systems of justice. There is not another Western European system that is as punitive, as inhumane as the American judicial system. It's a fact. In those countries, you go to jail, you serve time, you get out, you do have an opportunity to be rehabilitated as a citizen. You do get your rights back. Here, if you go to prison, in the vast majority of states, your rights are taken away from you forever.
Yes.
You'll never be allowed to vote. You probably won't ever be allowed to really, in some states, even ever rent an apartment. Certainly not one that's subsidized by the state or the government. But the other part of this is, you say that you think we've become more enlightened. I wonder, because in the 70s, and one of the things this book points out is that we had fewer than 350,000 people in the 70s. Yeah. And then an increase by the 80s, there was over 4.5 million people on probation or in jail. But in the 70s, we actually had programs in prison where people get a college degree. That was actually, I want to say, fairly universal. I'm sure there were states that didn't have it, but it was more true than not. That you go to prison, you get a GED, you take college level classes. They had other things one could do to help you when you got out. Today, that's been taken away for the most part. And I try to bring some of it back. But if you remember during I
remember.
And I believe it was during the 80s and certainly the 90s, when there was a push to take away everything. Not even libraries. They couldn't have libraries in prisons. Certainly in the prisons that had libraries.
I remember. Yeah.
And this is talk about punitive. So the intent was to keep the people that ignorant, to keep them subjugated when they got out. It was not about rehabilitation in the least.
No.
It was about punishment. And and I'll end on this. Given that we know some people who've been sent to prison were innocent. Some people we know now were executed who were innocent. Mm-hmm. We only know that not because the government's kept statistics or the government has tried to change that, because in the people who are of good hearts went in and down those people. Attorneys on their own dime did that. Organizations did that. We don't,
Yeah.
that's the reason why we know it. In fact,
Yeah.
often the case was that those judicial systems will stay fort tooth and nail to keep that information from them. So, I go back to it, and I hate to be this harsh about it, but I find very little that is positive about the criminal justice system in this country when it comes to people of color. Now, I know I'm overstating the facts, but when you look at it as a whole, when you look at those statistics, it's hard to clean anything from them that
Right.
you can say it's at least a bit positive.
Yeah, no, I'm not minimizing that. What I think is really interesting is there's this kind of mindset where, I mean, you see some cities and some states trying to, when they're presented with some facts about someone being innocent. But the vast majority of states still is, they will never agree or admit, that is, that there has been a wrongful conviction. It's very hard to turn aside a conviction in most states. And this idea that, we see it now more and more because of the availability of videos. We see encounters with police. In most cases, they turn violent because of the police officer. And even where there's some resistance, it's like, I'm talking about someone the size that they're, look, why am I, I don't need to get out of my car. Why am I, being hassled? What? That's an invitation to get your butt kicked.
Yes, it is. Particularly
so then they get you, when they get you on the original charge, what's the fallback? Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. Mm-hmm. And then they throw you into the system.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, it's up to the discretion of the DA, but in many cases, what should have been a simple misdemeanor suddenly turns into a felony because it becomes multiple charges.
Well, the good news is, if there's any good news in all of this, is that with the advent of cameras, telephone cameras, with the fact that numbers of police have been caught lying, and in New York City, they call it, there's a term they call it when cops lie, because it's so prevalent. And I have yet to read about a cop who lies in a case being charged with perjury, or in that matter, a cop that has lied and sent people to prison being held accountable.
Yeah, well, that's just.
And so, again, this gets back to this whole thing. If you're saying to people that there has to be law and order, if you're saying that there's respect for police, how can you say that with a straight face, given what it has been the experience of those people who are under that yoke?
I know we could talk forever about the punishment chapter. I think that one of the things that kind of goes back to this basic issue is, what is it that we want out of our criminal justice system?
Here's a question I'm saying. As you asked that question, I have one to ask of you. So since we gripe, I in particular gripe about the criminal justice system in this country, how would one fix it? How would one make a more equitable system of justice for people of all colors?
I think that was the question I was just trying to get to, which is that we have created this. Well, first of all, we should, because this subject has been, particularly in the last 2 years, has been the focus of a reform movement, actually going back to Obama. Mm-hmm. But here's the reality. The reality is that, and you see it now, where the district attorneys in several cities are being challenged because they were trying to, in Baltimore, in LA, now in New York, they were trying to, the most obvious one was in San Francisco, where they tried to implement some kind of reforms. And the pushback, because someone committed a crime or because of the rising crime, that was kiboshed. So the district attorney in San Francisco was recalled. And of course, there's the recall against the district attorney in Los Angeles. And I wonder if reform is even possible when you have an entrenched system from arrest to imprisonment and even release, that where everybody's got their hands in the pocket and making money off of it.
Lots of money. Everybody's making money off it, except for those who are victims.
But it's not just the lawyers, it's everybody, the bail bond industry that fought so hard against the coming up with a better system for bail than the ones that exist now, where, if you're poor, you ain't going to have the money for bail. I mean, all of these things, and they use, I'm not saying that there aren't people who are released and then go out and commit a new crime. But my point is that there is no system that I think allows for a equitable treatment of every person who goes through the system. Because why? This is the way they've been doing it since God left Chicago. This is the way things have been going on, and everybody's got a vested interest in keeping it that way. So this idea of reform, and what would reform even look like? Because, there's debates about that. You would have to remake every element of the, because we're so focused on the police and forget that there's a whole chain behind them, a whole ecosystem behind them, that where's the, if I'm driving around and I see two black guys or two brown guys standing on the corner who may be doing nothing more than waiting to cross the street, and my first instinct is they must be guilty of something. And then it begins. And then it begins. So I honestly, I don't know how you change it, because there's so many steps that you would have to change, so many elements, stages of that system you would have to change. But I just don't know how you would do that.
I can say how you could start. I can't say how to change, but how you start is to bring accountability into the system at all stages. And I know that's going to be tough because you have, again, the infrastructure behind it that is, as you pointed out, is vested interest. But unless till you have accountability.
No, I agree.
And I'll show you where, I can tell you where it works. I've seen it in the military. There is accountability. The military is not a panacea. It's not a perfect system, not even close to a perfect system. But in the military, there are rules, and the rules are laid out there, and they are for both the enlisted and the officers. Yes, you can point to times when officers get away with stuff, and they do, but it is far more equitable than here. And one of the reasons is because there is a certain amount of accountability. And the system we have now, there is no accountability, or very damn little. There's no watchdog, and this is part of the problem. If I go out as a cop and I commit violations against people's rights, there is not going to be anybody watching that. If somebody takes a photograph of it on a camera, okay, then it goes through a system. The unions are there to protect me. I'm not going to be interviewed until after I talk to the people, my fellow cops who were there on the scene, so we can get our story straight. That's what the union says. And then only then can I be questioned about what took place, as opposed to a citizen who supposedly has certain inalienable rights. They don't have that opportunity to basically confer with, they used to have a right to confer with their attorneys because of after Miranda rights. Well, that's been taken away. So, again, it comes down to me as starting with, and it ain't the panacea, it ain't the way to set the system, but would be accountability. The second thing I'd say would go a long way is the vetting of police officers. The vetting of police officers is almost non-existent, and particularly as it involves human rights. They say they get people in, they give them the gun, and essentially what they say is they turn them into a quasi-military soldier. And they tell them, the enemy is out there. And the enemy the uniform the enemy wears is their skin.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, I can expect, as always, blowback from the conservative right.
No.
But I will tell you, the blowback that I see occasionally from the so-called liberal left, who hears the cries about crime, rising crime, and suddenly they go from, oh, we need reform, to, you know what, we need to protect our citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And they just fall lockstep, like we talked about in the last episode. Biden asking for more cops, 100,000 cops. Remember, Clinton did the same thing.
Yes.
It's no different than whether it was Ronald Reagan or whether it was George Bush, and definitely not better than the last president, whose name will go unmentioned. Because that's the fallback, because they know that that's politically, it just will roll with folks. No one is, listen, I see these videos and I see the comments, and a lot of the comments are things like, well, what did they do before? What were they doing before the video started?
Yes,
or they shouldn't have resisted arrest. They shouldn't have questioned their arrest. They shouldn't have questioned the police. They shouldn't have resisted. They shouldn't have. These are not all conservatives saying those things. I've heard this from quote unquote, ordinary folks, mm-hmm. Black and brown folks, who say these things. And I will tell you, speaking of brown, and I know we don't have a lot more time, but speaking of brown, what's really been interesting is to listen to this growing group of folks who call themselves Latino, but are either Puerto Ricans or Cubans or Mexican Americans, who are starting to wow, man. Some of the stuff that I hear from them, and what really gets me is because there's this rising evangelical class mm-hmm. Group inside of this group, who are just, they're abandoning Democrats and liberalism for this kind of weird evangelical conservatism. Those are the ones that make me really cringe, mm-hmm. because they're about, when you hear them talk about crime and punishment, when they start quoting the Bible as their guide for punishment, that's when you're in trouble. And they're not as small as you think they are. They're a growing chorus of people.
Well, evangelism has been growing quickly in third world countries. because
and this
proselytizing.
right.
Proselytizing is a great part of it.
Yeah.
But a question for you: how much of this, what do you want to call it, blowback that you see among, I still say Spanish-speaking people for just lack of a better term.
Right.
How much of that blowback is the result of colorism? In other words,
that's a whole other show.
Yeah,
That's
I know,
a whole other
but
show.
I have a feeling it's threaded within this. That's a question I want.
And also, it's not just colorism. There's also this idea of, because I've talked about this before about, I really believe this about my father and mother. You know, you come to America and you want to be an American.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean?
Yep.
If they're getting all their cultural guidance from a racist country that teaches them, you know, if you want to be like us, these are the certain things you need to do. I'm not saying my mother and father were racist or anything like that, although my father did have his moments.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because he learned from the Irish and Italian folks that were working in his place.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of these factors coming together. And what also gets me is they're not all immigrants, although it was interesting, the New York Times podcast today, which I haven't finished, about the newest member of Congress who comes from the Rio Grande Valley,
mm-hmm.
who is a Latina. He describes himself as a Latina, who is, first of all, is an immigrant,
Mm-hmm.
the daughter of immigrants, who worked in the fields, who then married a law enforcement person who then became a border patrol person.
Mm-hmm.
And to listen to, and she's an evangelical,
Mm-hmm.
and to listen to her, it's scary.
Yeah.
She's not an old person. She's one of the youngest members of Congress. So I think there's a lot of factors here that contributes to this. And I think we could spend a whole other podcast, segment on it, episode. And I think at some point, as we conclude these chapters, we really do need to talk about what I think is sometimes the enemy is the enemy among us.
Yeah. It's just one note on that. I don't think it's only or predominantly Spanish-speaking people who fit into that category.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Because I know.
Yeah.
I know Black folks.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
And I know a couple of them I have once known as friends, so-called friends, who are very right-wing and are fairly racist in their own beliefs.
Yeah.
And and again, it's a search for being an American, and they have, in a couple of cases, individual cases I know, they've quote unquote made it. And it's kind of that old saw. I got on the yacht, and the boat sailed away from the dock, and I'm pulling it out of dock.
And let's not also forget about other immigrant communities,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's South Koreans, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Vietnamese, whether it's Middle Eastern.
Yeah.
People who we would like to consider people of color, but they get here, and my God.
But I am also just one last point on that, and I think it's kind of interesting because you pointed out, people from the Middle East to come here, and I do recall the encounters with people who were extraordinarily racist from the Middle East. I mean, to the point where they were more racist than many of the whites I knew.
Yeah.
What is interesting has been, though, with the, of course, after 9/11, with the persecution of those people, there's been a change. And I think that what happens to a lot of people, as long as they don't have to encounter that, that latent, because it's racism and it's let me more appropriate. It's white supremacy.
Yes.
That is really at play here.
Yes.
And that means anyone who's not from the European stock.
Yeah.
And even some people from the European stock don't fit in the category because they're Jews that they will look, some of those white supremacists find to be objectionable.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm just saying that, this happens to be a really complex issue that you just can't broadly wipe away with a single stroke of a brush.
Yeah, and I have to say that in closing, I'm looking for the end of this chapter, which there's a great line. Sorry, take a moment here, where he talks about, and I need to read this because this is just so important, I think. This is the last chapter of the last paragraph of the chapter, and it talks about a society recovering from a history of horrific human rights violations must make a commitment to truth and justice. Here's the really, really important part. As long as we deny the legacy of slavery and avoid this commitment, we will fail to overcome the racially biased, punitive systems of control that become serious barriers to freedom in this country. And it's tempting for some to believe otherwise, but much work remains. Mm. He hit it right on the nose there, because this will take a lot of work. And I don't know how you do that in a country that is so infected with the disease, the virus, the tumor of white supremacy, of racism, that it infects everybody who comes in contact with it, even those people who are considered non-white. And I don't know how you do that, but especially now with, let's not teach our history in elementary schools.
Can we end on an up note?
On a positive note. There you are.
You know me,
Thomas. Thank you. Give me some hope.
Yeah, there is a woman who's an organizer out of Memphis, Tennessee, and Memphis may be one of the most segregated cities still in the country. And I cannot remember the title of her organization, but she pointed out something that I thought was really pretty powerful. In Memphis, they were going to run a pipeline, an oil pipeline through the Black community, typical. And they actually stated up front, well, the reason why we're putting a pipeline through the Black neighborhood is because that's the path of least resistance, which has been true in many communities, in particular the community that's Black community in Memphis. However, one of the points was that the Memphis apparently has, pride to itself on the quality of its water, apparently has what they call sweet water. And she organized the people, not just in the Black community, but she also went and talked to the people in the white community. And she said that part of what happened is once they understood that their future water system was also wrapped up into protecting that community, the Black community, from having its rights denied and overridden, they then came together. And together they fought and they stopped the pipeline going through Black community. And she has had other successes where she talks about where she's gone into white communities, working class white communities in Memphis. And she said, I had a person who was, for that matter, fairly, when I spoke to the first time, fairly open and racist. It was a working mom who made less than $15 an hour. And she was bitching about the fact that these Blacks are lazy, they don't want to work. And so she put them together and she started organizing with them. This woman came around because she saw a commonality, which is that $15 an hour should be the minimum. And together they worked, not just this white one, but other whites, the blacks worked to get $15 minimum wage passed. And her comment, and this is what she says, we have dropped the ball. We allowed them to basically set the rules. What we have to do now is go out door to door and meet people face to face. She said, that's the only way you can do this. You meet face to face. They have been indoctrinated on TV, the movies, in church, that there is something that separates us, something called race, that we don't have any common goals, we don't have any common beliefs. And she said, you can break it down. And I do believe that's true.
Amen, Thomas.
I preach.
All right. Thank you again for looking at visiting us here on the 1619 podcast. See you again next time.
Next time.
All right.